Random encounters were a core part of the Final Fantasy experience for many years. Having been associated with the franchise since its birth, they persisted as a key gameplay mechanic for a majority of its mainline entries. And such was the prominence of the mechanic that even though the system itself has now been largely abandoned, its effects can still be felt. What made the system so infamous was that random encounters presented the player with roadblocks that could never be perfectly predicted. As such, they would serve as a resource drain between more prominent gameplay beats, and this not only added a sense of adventure, but also an element of peril. Players never knew when they would run into a threat that was simply too dangerous to handle, and this notion was further enhanced through the addition of horrible and rare random encounters, such as the Iron Giant in Final Fantasy II. And it meant that even though there may have been a feeling of comfort and assuredness as to how recent encounters had been handled, there was always the sense that a party wipe was just around the corner, something that would be made even worse had the game not been saved recently. There are some random encounters across the franchise, however, that are notorious for being terrible. We've covered a few of these before in previous videos, but for this video, we wanted to turn it over to you, the viewers. So with the caveat that we won't be including more than one random encounter per game, here are 7 of the hardest random encounters that made you, the viewers, regret not saving your game. And we're going to kick things off with the T-Rex Saw from Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII is a game known for its high level of customization thanks to junctioning. In the purest sense, players who understood the system could essentially self-select the difficulty of the game, and depending on the decisions players made through the junction system, many random encounters could either be trivialized or retain their challenge, a notion that could be pushed even further when introducing the unorthodox leveling system. For those players who were perhaps not quite as experienced though, one of the worst encounters in the early game was the T-Rex Saw. Most players would encounter this enemy at some point due to it having numerous spawn points throughout the game, but it was the encounter with the T-Rex Saw when venturing into the Balamb Training Center that was notorious. Knowing that such an enemy existed added a sense of unease, and this was a very intentional act by the developers, as they even made sure to underscore to the player that the T-Rex Saw was a particularly dangerous foe. This came via 2 sources. One, Quistis advising the player to run away if they ever encountered one, and a scan which would say, alive since the beginning of time, its power and HP are very high. It's better to run if you encounter one. Should that advice not be heeded, the T-Rex Saw would indeed be a fearsome foe. Its high strength stat would ensure any standard attacks dealt significant damage, but perhaps the most dangerous aspect was its tail whip. Due to its ability to deal physical damage to multiple party members simultaneously, this meant the T-Rex Saw could easily dish out damage to the party at a faster rate than they could recover. And as an interesting note, the frequency of use for tail whip would increase as its level scaled. This design element allowed the T-Rex Saw to remain more of a threat to the player as the party's strength naturally grew, something that could only be counteracted by enhanced knowledge of the junction system. Taking a step back to where it all began, due to it being the first Final Fantasy game with random encounters, the original Final Fantasy could be pretty unforgiving sometimes. Before modern quality of life focused remakes, players were not able to do things like create permanent saves anywhere they'd like. Instead, they had to opt for sleeping in inns or using consumables like tents. Limited flexibility in saving made the potential for running into a brutal random encounter feel all the more imposing. And although more modern versions like Dawn of Souls for the Game Boy Advance built in a permanent save feature directly into the main menu, there was still one random encounter that many players did not want to accidentally stumble upon. The enemy that some players consider to be Final Fantasy's first super boss, the War Mech. Fortunately, its encounter rate was notoriously low, with there being a 1 in 64 chance in the original Famicom version, and it could only be found in one location on the 5th floor of the bridge, just before the Tiamat fight inside the Flying Fortress. But as the encounter was so close to Tiamat, encountering War Mech and losing could be particularly devastating for a player. What made War Mech so troublesome was that it could only perform 2 damaging moves, a physical attack and nuke which dealt devastating non-elemental magic damage to all party members. Compounding this, War Mech would regenerate HP each turn, serving to prolong the encounter and stretch the party even more thin on resources. But despite the challenge, which can still catch some unsuspecting players off guard, over the years, many players have been motivated to persevere in order to obtain rare drops that have become associated with this infamous enemy. Now, chocobos are not generally considered to be intimidating creatures, often implemented in the franchise in ways that emphasize their fun, lovable, and playful nature. Often, combat-orientated versions of chocobos in this series take on more comedic roles, as can be seen with the Fat Chocobo or the Chocobo Chick. However, Final Fantasy Tactics took a different approach. Chocobos in this game are no joke. The ones that were combat-focused were powerful and had high mobility, and beyond that, the different breeds of chocobos had different strengths. The base yellow variant, simply titled Chocobo, could use Chocobo Cure to heal and prolong its life, while on the other side of the spectrum, the red Chocobo could use the powerful Choco Meteor attack. The black Chocobo variant, on the other hand, was able to remove status ailments such as Silence, Poison and Disable, among others, through its Choco Isuna. In small groups, these Chocobos were somewhat manageable. However, their strengths complemented one another when multiple colours appeared in a large group, making for a very challenging encounter. This is why the mass Chocobo random encounter in the FNAF River is infamously hard to overcome. Players venturing into this area may encounter an enemy group with a large number of Chocobos, and potentially a small assortment of other enemies. Dealing with many Chocobos at once was particularly difficult because they could deal massive damage to a single or small number of targets very quickly. It was also easy for a group of Chocobos to bombard the player's party as they approached, and if a member of the party got caught up in a melee fight with a single Chocobo, they could become a prime target for ranged attacks from Chocobos nearby when using the Choco Meteor attack. Their offensive power was then complemented by their high mobility, which served to prolong the battle, further whittling away the player's resources and chances of survival. The Midgardsormr serves as one of the most infamous encounters in Final Fantasy VII. This was, in no part, due to its narrative significance, as the developers created a short set piece that was designed to highlight the difference between the party's strength and that of Sephiroth. This was further emphasised as the Midgardsormr was by no means a pushover, and unlike a typical random encounter, it was foreshadowing. When attempting to access the Mithril Mines, players would need to cross the marshes, and they would be able to see the shadow of a Midgardsormr worming its way around. If the player attempted to cross the marshes on foot, this ominous shadow would pursue them, and it was for this reason that riding a Chocobo over the marsh was recommended. But new players may be caught off guard, and if they came into contact with the shadow, a challenging battle would ensue. Players who chose to fight the Midgardsormr rather than fleeing would be in for a grueling battle. At level 26, the Midgardsormr had 4000 HP, and it meant most parties would not be equipped to defeat this enemy when they first encountered it. For one, the battle was designed to provide the player with a false sense of hope. This was because the Midgardsormr would enter different phases at various points in the battle. These phases would be initiated via HP drops, and when its HP dropped too far, this would eventually lead to the Midgardsormr using the Beta ability, which would deal huge amounts of fire damage to the entire party. The Midgardsormr would also be able to use an ability called Blown Away, which would eject party members from the battle rather than killing them. Even if the Midgardsormr managed to be defeated though, this wouldn't be the end of it, as it would simply respawn, and all these aspects combined made it stand out even more due to its design mirroring a traditional boss battle. Although Jackanapes have not featured prominently in any mainline Final Fantasy games outside of Final Fantasy V, their appearance in that game was more than enough to live on in the nightmares of players all around the world. Jackanapes could be encountered at numerous points in the game, but one of the most curious aspects was that their HP never increased. It was always locked at an ominous 666. Due to their HP remaining constant, Jackanapes were more challenging to overcome when first encountered in the game, and this was naturally compounded by the party having less access to combat options. However, even though it may seem illogical, Jackanapes would be a consistent threat even when encountered much later. Part of this was because even though their HP did not increase, their stats did, and their stats were rather high relative to where you would encounter them. Jackanapes also had a propensity to back attack the party, placing them with an immediate advantage, and they could also use their critical attack ability to bolster their damage output. Due to the difficulty posed, the safest course of action would often be to flee, but even this wasn't straightforward. For those able to survive long enough, Jackanapes would use an ability called Moon Flute. This afflicted its subject with a berserk status, preventing them from being able to take manual actions, also preventing their ability to flee. Now, being an early entry into the franchise, Final Fantasy II is known for introducing many newer elements that would have a legacy far beyond that game. Prominent examples of this are the Chocobo and a character named Cid. But Final Fantasy II also introduced many other mainstays, one of which is the now iconic Curl enemy. After appearing in Final Fantasy II, the Curl has featured in almost every major numbered game and countless spin-offs. And due to the abilities often associated with Curls, it's rare that they are ever an easy encounter. But Final Fantasy II was where the legacy started, and in that particular game, they were tough as nails when fought as a group. There was one encounter, which should be noted was not a random encounter, that epitomized this. Loot-hungry players who found themselves exploring Castle Palamecia's 6th floor would pass by a conveniently placed chest holding a sunblade. Any unsuspecting players who opened the chest would face a monster in a box. This saw them ambushed by a Lamia Queen and a group of Curls, and this combination was rather devilish. As for why, well, what made this encounter particularly harsh was the ability known as Blaster X, which was used by Curls to afflict the party with paralysis. This threat was then elevated by the presence of the Lamia Queen. Even if Blaster X missed the party, the Lamia Queen could compensate by temporarily removing party members from combat through the use of status effects like sleep. Having to deal with a group of enemies that could incapacitate the party in various ways made this ambush particularly challenging, but it was the Curls and their Blast X ability spam that could make this one encounter that some players just wouldn't walk away from. That then brings us onto the final entry on this list, which, much like the first entry, is also about a dinosaur. The name Brachiosaur can strike fear into those people who have played Final Fantasy VI due to how incredibly tough and resilient they were as random encounters, and indeed inside the Colosseum. Due to their relative strength, Brachiosaur had a very low encounter rate out in the wild, similar to the likes of Warmech and the Iron Giant in the earlier days of the franchise. And should you be unfortunate enough to encounter one at random, you'd be faced with an enemy with a huge HP pool of 46,000 and massive physical and magic defense. The Brachiosaur would also come equipped with a wide range of powerful and nasty abilities. This included the all too familiar Ultima, which by this point was a recurring spell in the franchise. But Ultima wasn't the only high damage ability that the Brachiosaur could rely on. In addition, they could also cast Meteor and use Spin. Both of these abilities had the potential to deal massive damage, and even its sneeze was enough to devastate the party thanks to its snort ability. Notably, when encountered outside of the Colosseum, Brachiosaur would even have a 33% chance of using Disaster on its first turn in the encounter. It meant that if probability wasn't in your favour on multiple counts, Disaster would afflict the party with various status effects that would make the rest of the encounter even more difficult. Anyone who did win the fight would get some nice rewards, but there was a serious dose of risk versus reward for anyone who wanted to try and farm Brachiosaur. That sentiment probably applies though to many of these encounters, but there's also a dose of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. With that though, we'd love to hear how many of these encounters ended up making you curse your luck, so be sure to let us know in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Sukin TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.